I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Yeah, so we're back for our Grange. We did a podcast earlier this month where we talked about the possible distinction between nationalism and patriotism, and we felt like we had more to say about that. So so Spencer, you said you had some more thoughts that you didn't think you quite got out in our podcast. So why don't you tell me what they are?
Well, I just want to be clear. I think it was an implication to be drawn, but if this distinction holds true between patriotism and nationalism, that the tragedy of modern life is that people's legitimate, virtuous, patriotic sentiments end up getting sublimated into nationalist, at least ideas, if not like actual politics. And if you're not aware of that, then what you think is patriotism objectively turns into nationalism. And that's a big part of why so many people still are nationalistic. Like, it's a legitimate good impulse, and it's just siphoned off to this, at best, very dubious thing.
Right, yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, it's a legitimate impulse because it's the impulse to kind of love and care for your own place, which I guess would also be just natural, right? To the extent that you are like actually attached to the place. And then it becomes something else and kind of malignant when it turns into nationalism, which maybe would you say that it's like part of what the difference is that nationalism is detached from place in a way? It becomes more just like an ideology.
I think so. Or to the extent that it's not detached from place, it's closer to, I mean, this was said in the podcast, it's closer to what used to be called an empire. Like, the United States is not a country. Like, and the fact that we think it is a country is a symptom. Or the United States is not a nation in the classical sense. And the fact that we talk about it as if it were a nation obscures the fact that, like, it's even in our words, like the United States.
Right. So
it's a bunch of states that are federally united. And so to the extent that we think the United States is like the federal government, we're already showing that we've sort of like lost the plot of what like human scale polities or republics are.
Okay, that makes sense. If we were to like look at a country like Italy or France, Maybe, I don't know, like they also have, a diversity of different expressions within their country, but they're not federal in the same way. And there's more of a sort of ethnic dimension to their own nation state concept. Could we make the same point that patriotism to an Italian would be loving their place with, the whole boot of Italy, I suppose.
I would
As
ultimately,
opposed to,
I would
yeah, go
say
ahead.
even that it bears the same imprint of what I'm talking about. Like Italy had
Okay.
a unification process in the 19th century.
Hmm. Yes, they did. Yeah,
And,
which
and
is partly why.
this is what like the absolutist monarchies did, that they like created these centralized proto nation states out of what previously were like highly diverse ethnic groups, language groups, whatever. And so even the fact that we take it for granted that the French nation speaks the French language is like a modern development.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah,
But I guess where America is like Europe squared is it does seem to, just like if you look like on a map, the size Italy is closer to the size of a U.S. nation or a U.S. state. France is more or less the same size as Kansas.
right.
And there's no comparing France to the nation state that is the United States, size-wise, I think that's
Arguably, arguably the country was never conceived of as your typical nation state, right? But right from the beginning, it was conceived as this federation of states.
Well, right from the beginning, it depends on who you ask. That was the Federalist take, but the anti-Federalist take was that no, it should be more what I'm talking about, right?
It should have been, yeah, that's right. That would be their view, but it didn't turn out to be that way, And so our country is, at least from the second constitution, was seems consciously conceived as a federation of states with certain things that we do together and many things which are done more at the local or state level. But maybe part of the reason why nationalism has become kind of on the upswing here is because the federal government has taken a lot of that power back from states and continues to do so all the time.
I mean,
so
that's
now,
I don't fully grant that nationalism is on the upswing, but to the extent that it is, it's because people have some sense that the national interests are being betrayed or destroyed. And they're trying to assert that in the name of patriotism - nationalism.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which in America's case is definitely more of an idea that they feel, it's being betrayed in the ideological space, it seems like to me. For instance, maybe an American thinks, well, as an American, I deserve to be prosperous, or, this is kind of my birthright as economic opportunity or, what else? Freedom, whatever that means to them. And so, and then people feeling kind of betrayed because they haven't had those things delivered to them. It's a very different way of thinking, I think, than, like Peter Morin, who I'm studying, right? When he left his village in southern France, he was leaving a way of life that was left over from that consolidation process, that hadn't fully happened and probably still hasn't. It was a particular way of life. His love for his country, if he had it, would have been associated with that way of life in that particular area, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And a big part of his source of fleeing was, the national level repression of the religious orders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, among other things, right. Yep. And, he was being asked to do military service for a country that maybe he didn't fully support their agenda as
Sure.
well.
Right.
But he wouldn't have been thinking like, I'm leaving France because France promised me prosperity, and why am I still a peasant? He wouldn't have been thinking like that, I don't think. But that's the way Americans think.
Right. Because we're inherently, especially modern Americans, the ideal is no longer to be like a yeoman householder.
Right. Yeah, it's just a very different way of thinking. And it's not a way of thinking that really emphasizes, I know people are thinking this way now, but like it doesn't really emphasize ethnicity or language or, any sort of tribal kind of feelings. It kind of elicits the social contract idea, like I need certain things delivered, and either it does and then I'm happy with my country, or it doesn't and I'm angry with my country.
Sure. Or put another way, it's very bourgeois.
Mm-hmm.
That the underlying thing is we're rootless cosmopolitans who are seeking our own rational self-interest, at best in collaboration with others, and at worst in competition with each other.
Right. So in this type of thing, patriotism, probably the type that you're talking about, probably isn't too possible. Right. But only nationalism would be really possible because we think in terms of the government needs to deliver whatever it is, whatever was promised in our social contract as we conceive it. That's what it's for, kind of like business. It's very bourgeois.
Or but there's two. There's a right bourgeois and a left bourgeois. The left bourgeois is the government needs to deliver these services. The right bourgeois is the government needs to get out of the way so that civil society can deliver these services.
I think that's like the old right, the sort of Reagan right. But I think that's like falling apart.
Right?
What?
So what they called in the 70s and 80s the new right?
Yeah, I guess so. I forgot that they did that, but I'll take your word for it.
Mm-hmm.
It was very associated with Reagan and Thatcher. And it was more liberal, but I don't think a lot of people who identify as right today, I think they want their government to deliver many things, right? And they're looking at it much the way a left liberal or a Democrat might. They just want different things. Like, well, they wanted not to have wars. That was one thing they wanted. They want a stronger economy, but I think a lot of people realize the government has a lot to do with that. So I don't hear them saying we need to get government out of our lives now. I think they're very accepting of like the big government. It's just that they want different things.
Right. They want to be able to themselves to the big government, which you might say is another turn of the screw as the dialectic unfolds.
Yeah, I actually think it's kind of a bad development, but it does show that I think most Americans now see government as Big Daddy, the solver of all problems, the deliverer of whatever it is that you want delivered. And to get back to our main point, I guess I feel like that is, if you think of government or your country that way, it kind of makes it impossible to feel those patriotic feelings.
or you transfer them on to the federal government. The so-called,
Yeah, and then that nationalism?
I think that's a good working definition of what it means to be nationalistic in America right now. And obviously, it takes left-wing and right-wing forms, and it takes conscious and unconscious forms. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what, when most people mean they're patriots, they mean that on the whole, the United States government and its people, especially its people, the overlap, the ambiguous overlap of those two things, the government and the people. That's what we have to, that's what we have to reconcile ourselves to and serve and give thanks for.
Right. So I'll give an example of the type of like big government serving the, sort of like serving the right, spending, billions of dollars on trying to get immigrants out so that people who feel like they do belong here don't have to compete with them, which is kind of the opposite of the full-on liberal Reagan type old style conservatism, because in that world competition was good, and and people would fill slots that were needed in the economy based on rational self-interest. And so the market was good and it would work out all those problems. Whereas now we basically have like a huge jobs program. I mean, arguably it won't work. I don't see it really working because it's kind of been done in a half-assed way, but it's a lot of money being spent. And I think, well, there's just generally like, the idea that the government should protect us from competition, both from inside and outside of the country's borders. So it needs to deliver on that.
Yeah. Although I would qualify what you're saying. I think the claim is the government needs to protect us from unfair competition.
But all competition is unfair from this perspective.
From what perspective?
From the perspective of the worker who thinks that they haven't gotten the job that they deserve.
Yes, if what we're talking about is a petty person who's feeling resentful and wants revenge.
That's what we're talking about. Are you kidding me? That's like most people.
Well,
come on, they don't make decisions on the basis of principles. They're not thinking like that.
Be more charitable towards people's intellectual positions.
Well, I don't. I mean, that's interesting because usually you're the cynic, but like,
and I think the site of the critique should actually be on their emotional and moral failings, more on the political, ideological epiphenomenon.
Okay, maybe explain that, like how that would help me see it clearly.
If what you're saying is basically these, revanchist American workers that don't want any competition, fair or unfair, then it seems to me that your grievance with them should be lodged against their moral failings, not against the kind of nationalist, nativist, border policing politics that flows from that.
Right.
And I wouldn't necessarily associate wanting a nativist, closed border, national nation state policy with just petty people wanting to keep the scary outside competitive world at bay. I wouldn't totally identify those two things.
Well, I'll clarify, that I don't necessarily believe in fact, I don't believe in the free market ideology. And I do think that we ought to protect our country's economy to a certain extent. But I also do think that most people think in a very narrow, selfish way, and that they're not very capable of. They're very prone to saying, if it hurts me, it's unfair. Now, that's kind of irrelevant, I guess, as far as the, what decision makers do. But I genuinely, I mean, I've seen so much of that, right? And I mean, I do it, you do it, everybody does it, right? When it's like, when it directly impacts you, then your mind goes towards, okay, how is this unfair to me? Who's done what to me? That's just human nature. And politicians exploit that.
I'd clarify that's fallen human nature.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes,
That's true.
and then to the extent that we are redeemed or regenerated, we should not be behaving and thinking and behaving that way.
No. And,
Yes.
I have this, political science hat, which basically says for the purposes of prediction, you look at what most people do most of the time. But of course, from the moral philosophic perspective, that's exactly what you shouldn't do, right? Like, that's very true. But I do think that, part of like, well, we're getting a little bit far afield, but I'll finish my thought and then maybe we can get back to it. But like, a leader does have a responsibility to protect their society from too much competition, partly because if they don't, they get this kind of upheaval that we're experiencing now. So it's really important to anticipate that and realize that, I mean, part of what people, especially in a country like this, want is to be taken care of, right? And if they don't feel like they're taken care of, then they will get angry. And this is what we're seeing, So I think it's pretty important to do that for prudential reasons, among others. But we miscalculated. So I guess the leaders, right? We have like, I think almost everybody is seeing this now, that our leaders, both on the Democrat and the Republican side, have not been very competent for quite a while now, and have not anticipated, a lot of our problems are a long time coming, right? Whether it's climate change, immigration problems caused by that, plus just globalized competition. We've seen this coming for decades, but it seems like right when these things reach a critical mass in the past, say, 2 decades, we've had like the least leaderly ability. And, people blame the gerontocracy. Well, that's part of it, but I dare say, and I think we shouldn't have people who are in their 80s, running around trying to lead the country, but it's more than that, because I think that you could go to the next generation or two down and you would find
and
the
you could
same,
go to the next generation or two past.
if you could find them, Yeah, I know what you mean. Some of them are still alive. They're the people that, like my dad fought in World War II. But, yeah, right. I don't know. Anyway, so let me see if I can tie this back into what we were talking about. It seems to me like those dynamics that I'm talking about have just led people down this path of nationalism, or whatever you want to call it, big state ideology that, wants, sort of sees the government as this provider of all good things. And then it's that which you love, the big daddy that, gives you things and takes care of you. And it's where your identity should lie, kind of like, in the Soviet Union, that everybody is supposed to love, Brezhnev, like see Brezhnev's like beautiful face everywhere. And
I would concede this, but I would say it's just as true to say that for every one of those people, there's about another person who's a sort of internationalist, sort of humanistic, secular humanist type that also has basically baked in a kind of unconscious nationalism that they think is integrated in a global humanity. And we should be able to fight a sort of explicit nationalism in the name of this globalist humanity.
Oh yeah,
They'll
yeah. They
nevertheless
wouldn't
depend
see.
on nationalist structures. So,
Hmm.
so again, to me, these people are just like left-wing crypto nationalists.
Yeah, I've got no problem with that. I think the problem is partly in the language that we have to use now because nationalism has been so associated with the right, right? But like if you think of it as kind of like big state ideology or big daddyism, then you can definitely see that both sides pretty much make that assumption, and they want to define America, right, as what it is that they want out of it, you
Which is,
know.
yeah, which is either basically WASP or multiracial, multi-religious, whatever. WASP or
Hmm.
cosmopolitan.
Right. And honestly, the multiracial, multi-ethnic diversity is closer to the sort of liberal ideology of the founding, in the sense that it didn't have any reasons baked into it. Not the founding, like the second constitution event did
Yeah.
not have ethnicity or
But
anything like that really big.
because it was the material reality.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the rational kernel in like the anti-racist people when they call, take your pick, Rousseau, Kant, the American founding as racial liberalism. That they were taking for granted that the liberalism they were putting forward was of a white straight male sort. Obviously, that's the only people that can be liberals, and it was so obvious they didn't have to say it.
Well, I mean, they put in the three-fifths compromise. They recognized that there was a problem with like slavery, and what are we going to do with these folks in the long run? I mean, some of these people actually like really sweated about that, huh?
When did that happen? With
Well,
the
wasn't that pretty close to the beginning, if not at the beginning of the? I can't remember for sure exactly when that happened, but it wasn't close to the
it was
Civil
the
War, I don't believe.
1987 Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. So, I mean, they were thinking about that.
Yeah, but even
Um,
that is an exception that proves my rule. The fact that it had to be figured out how much white people is a
I
black
know,
part is
right?
basically making my point and their point.
Which is
That
ridiculous. But I will say though, like despite these people, if we separate their particular prejudices from their actual thoughts, which is a thing that can be done,
by
you
they you
know,
mean founding fathers,
yeah,
and you mean
the
a majoritarian critical mass within those founding fathers that were able to craft the
I
documents.
think, yeah, the ones that actually crafted the documents that, that actually have, continue to exist, um, were, the philosophy that they embraced inherent within it, whether they fully realized that or not, is a sort of colorblind, ethnicity blind, religion blind, neutral mechanism type of thinking that allows for, it's enlightenment thinking, and at its very core is a kind of universalism that erodes any sort of ethnic, religious particularism. It just does. And so they might not have been ready to fully live that out, and they weren't. Um, People have their moral failings, but that doesn't mean that the ideology that they embraced wasn't, basically like universalist and kind of anti-particular. And
Which once
and I
again,
think that's
another
that's how,
manifestation of revolution.
yeah, right. I mean, that's how you get this idea that government needs to give you everything. It needs to fulfill all promises. It needs to get anything out of the way that's standing in your way, because it is nothing but that, like it was designed to be something that serves us. It doesn't represent who we are as, whether, like if we identify as WASPs or, ethnic Catholics or whatever we are, it doesn't represent us at that level. It's a contract.
I suppose so, but I think to some extent you're taking for granted that we can look back on this from 250 years, say, and know how it turned out and think that it's obvious that these are the implications. This is implicit in these ideas, and presumably, I mean, my gut feeling is that if these founders lived, as long as early biblical patriarchs, roughly half of them at some point in the development of American history would be horrified by the implications of the unfolding that we've seen.
For sure. I mean, they would be horrified.
Not what I mean. And but they would adopt some sort of reactionary stance.
I think what's happened is an unintended consequence, or maybe that's how they would see it, that, like this was an unintended consequence of what they thought would lead to a republic of free individuals, right? But when free and, Tocqueville's right, like when free individuals are that free and they don't have the buffer of like, whether it's ethnos or community, religion, some sort of glue where people can actually cooperate with each other.
Religio.
Yeah. Right. Then they're going to just think government has to help. Government's the only one, right, that can help us out.
Sure. Right. And then at a deep level, 98% of us agree. And again, pick your flavor. Do you want the Democrats and globalism implicitly with nationalism, or do you want the Republicans and explicitly nationalism with an implicit internationalism? Take your pick. Like, it's all the same.
But neither one of those is like, patriotic, or
in the classical
we're
talking about.
Right.
Right, but they both have to feed off of people's patriotic sentiments.
Sure.
But
or
yes.
Their nationalistic sentiments that
but
mistake.
Sure. Again, I'm trying to give the charitable read and basically make the argument that en masse we're given this Foucaultian blackmail that you get two choices. Do you want internationalist nationalism or nationalist internationalism?
That's well put.
And to me, like the so-called phenomenon of Christian nationalism is people just congregating at a certain take on this and then being able to reconcile themselves to being one wing of whatever.
Sure. And I don't dispute that they are one wing of that.
Well, they're a wing of it. Yeah.
I think that it's particularly a problem when Christianity very explicitly moves down that path and sort of equates God's agenda with the government's agenda to provide. Like either God provides or the government provides, but if we like smash those two together and basically treat the government like it is representing God, then we have committed a theological error, I guess, and then if Christianity gets subsumed like that, then it doesn't exist outside of that. It could even disappear entirely, if people don't remember it's not about that.
Sure. It's not fully about that, but it is slightly about that, I think. Or I guess I take to be sort of the center of the Catholic position is that to a greater extent, everything in life mediates God to us. So therefore, again, at least if we lived in actual Christian polities that we could be genuinely patriotic to, we would be able to feel and perceive God's will in the acts of government, which is not to say that we wouldn't see them in all sorts of other aspects of life. That's where like the modern absolutism comes in. It's not like the nation, especially the nation state, is like the only organ by which God's will could be found.
So let me ask you a question which might get to the heart of why I'm having problems with this. We've established, and I think this is true, that even the Pope doesn't fully mediate like God through to Christians, right? And that only on some occasions when he's teaching in the area of, critical items of faith, dogmas, are we to like 100%, adhere to what the Pope is saying. Otherwise, it's kind of like the Pope's opinion. And then there's, all of the rest of us who are kind of fulfilling our own responsibilities. Is that how we should see government as well, as very rarely, if ever? I mean, well, another way to put this is if the Pope doesn't mediate God to us for the most part, and we don't really have to pay full attention to every word he says, then how does government do that in any way, shape, or form?
Well, before I answer that, I want to take a half step back. There are like gradations of teaching. And so I believe the Catholic position is also that we need to give, I think the term is obedience of intellect and will. Something like we need to give obedience of intellect and will to the teachings, not just of like ex cathedra statements or the declarations of ecumenical councils, but even the so-called ordinary and universal magisterium. Now, that is not to say that the teachings of the ordinary and universal magisterium are necessarily infallible or always of a kind of like dogmatic character. But there's a big gray area where it's not like it must 100% be believed, but it's also not to just be 0% believed, or, it's basically the equivalent of like the church just passing gas. Like, which is where a lot of people want to take this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I would argue that model of we should generally trust in ordinary circumstances, we should totally trust in very extraordinary circumstances, and we should totally distrust in very extraordinary circumstances. I think that can be analogously applied all the way down the chain, whether that's to basically our emperors, whoever they are, down to our kings or whatever the equivalent of kings would be, down to the leaders of our guilds, and down to like the leaders of the family. It seems to me that's a good model of general obedience and exceptional disobedience. I think that's a good Catholic answer for the most part. You don't look impressed.
I don't know exactly what to make of it. I mean, like all faiths, I suppose a lot of people want to have it every which way they want it. But it seems to me like if you have this big gray area where you can use a lot of your judgment, then we're back in this state where it's really you, the individual, who's really in charge of what they believe and what they'll do. So I've always been kind of uncomfortable with that. I mean, it's important to me to like know what I'm supposed to pay attention to for real, not what I'm supposed to exercise my judgment on. And I guess to know the difference.
Right. And it seems to me a general rule, and I think the way I would qualify what you just said is it's not like, yes, there is a big gray area, but that gray area is mediated hierarchically. So why I don't care too much about there are Christian nationalist ideas out there and Christian nationalist identifying people running around out there. I'm not running the Republican Party. Like I have no station in society other than running this kind of, or being part of running this kind of underground educational salon. Other than that, nobody gives a shit what I think. I have no real power. So therefore, it's not really my problem. Especially when I'm doing a sort of bare minimum of helping out at this underground salon to try and educate people who have the will and or the privilege to care. Not my problem.
Mm-hmm.
And
But
so,
saying it's not your problem is different from saying it's not a thing or it's not an important thing, right? It could be a very important thing that's going to affect our faith and our country, and it's still not your problem, right? So is that what you're saying? Is that it is kind of, it's pretty important
yeah,
right now,
yeah,
or
I
it
guess
has been for a while?
I would say it's. I mean, I'm not denying. First of all, I've never denied that like it doesn't exist.
I'm
I've
pretty
just
sure you have. It's just been a few years,
I've
but
denied its relative importance because yes, I'll grant it has effects in the world, but you know, right now I'm surrounded by a bunch of like artists and activists that are more of the internationalist national bent, and these ideas are at least as powerful as Christian nationalism in the world, in America, and arguably
mhm.
more so. Um, and so I guess what I mean when I say it's not my problem, it's not that I don't, to various degrees, dislike these ideas, and it's not that they won't have an effect on me or other people. When I say it's not my problem, it's I have no culpable, and I've thought a lot about this, and I've really concluded I have no culpable responsibility or culpability. Like I
You
don't know
mean
what, like the
you
only,
mean responsibility, I think, because culpability would be like direct guilt in the matter, I think.
yeah, I guess I would assume culpable. Yeah, let's Google it.
Okay. Because I think what you're saying is you don't have any responsibility to do something about it because you wouldn't be able to have much impact. But if you're saying you don't have any,
Responsibility for a fault or wrong, blame. So yeah, I guess
mhm.
culpability is what happens when you fail in your responsibilities.
Right, right.
Right. And nobody's asking me what should be done about Christian nationalism, like as a job. It's not my
Hmm.
job to figure any of this out. And I have no real power other than, again, being a voice on the internet and in a very small subculture in Kansas City. Now, where I would, if I was like an aide to a senator, I would start to feel like I have some responsibility. And even then they can wiggle out. They can say, "Oh, I'm just a little grain of sand and on the beach or whatever." You can still wiggle out and say I don't have any real responsibility. But there's whole spheres of life where I have very little responsibility. And therefore, it is irresponsible for me to worry about them inordinately when it comes at the cost of me doing a good
Yeah.
job I am responsible for.
Well, I can understand that and largely agree with it. You do something that doesn't really directly intersect with that stuff. So you're not faced with like continual kind of ethical decision making regarding what you go along with and what you don't. If you worked for the government, you would be in that position, right? Like, should I follow this order? Do I reflect this official stance? You know, should I stay away from work? Should I go to work? I mean, so I think that federal employees and state employees have
Have
to face this all
ask
the
themselves,
time.
do they want to do some Schindler's List sort of thing? Hmm.
Well, I mean, every day, every government employee, even before all this kind of went down, faced like continual, if you're a person who's trying to be morally good, you face continual ethical choices. You're constantly having to splice and dice, or at least I do, exactly what the right move is relative to my character and so on and so forth. And then when when political when politics heats up, that definitely puts ordinary people who have government jobs or are contractors for government, and let's face it, that's a lot of people, into a position of not being able to avoid dealing with it because it directly impacts them in their moral character, right? They have to try to assess, okay, what's going on? Can I do this thing? Should I do this thing?
Right. Although I would somewhat, I mean, we're being kind of abstract. My sense is 80% of the time when people are thinking these things, at the end of the day, they still don't really, all they can do is conscientiously object or go with the flow. And then you can always shift gears. Again, you can be the figurative Schindler List. You can go with the flow so that you can then go against the flow when it seems prudent or morally responsible to do so. But part of what, I mean, this gets to the root of 80% of you and my's beef about the news. These people's engagement is still highly mediated by what the people above them in the hierarchies are doing. And so I think you can get too caught up in still trying to figure out what's the right thing to do and lose sight of the fact that you're still overdetermined by what the hierarchs who are more culpable are doing.
They're more culpable, but I mean, if you look at the Nazi example, which I spent a third of a semester on in administrative ethics to grad students, you know, I mean, a big reason why that kind of unfolded was because the people down the chain said, it's not my business. I don't have any impact. I'm being given a legal order. It's my job. And so I think that there's in a society like that, and we have a society like that. It's a modern, heavily bureaucratized, collectivized society full of, you know, fractured, you know, departments and all of that. We have a very similar setup. The same reasoning definitely occurs, and everybody in that chain is culpable. And that's why it's really important for a Christian to actually think, right? Like during times like this, if they're in that type of position, I don't think it's possible. It's not, well, I should say it's possible. It's not morally right to not think about your part that you play. We all play a certain part, right? Even as consumers and whatever. But many of us play a fairly direct part. And if we say, I am not at all responsible, I don't have to use my judgment at all, we definitely are contributing to the technical rationality that produces modern disasters. And we've seen it over and over again. So, yeah, the people at the top, you know, they come up with these ideas and they make these orders, but I don't think it absolves other people from that responsibility. And I realize that's an extreme example. This is not exactly the same. You know, our society isn't exactly the same, but it's similar. It's similar in its structure, you know?
And yes, it is because they are all, what we're always talking about is modern nation states, which inevitably build up some sort of deep state and a bureaucratic layer and they reorganize society in their image. And then people become dominated by and complicit in all of this stuff. You know? And I'm not saying exactly that it's just the leaders that are in charge. I'm just saying the foundation of prudence in these situations is recognizing that people are basically powerless down most of the chain to make any real difference, and therefore the cost of making a difference is at least a white, if not a red martyrdom. or it's a bunch, it's a life filled with compromises and prudential decisions that will slightly modify the future. But now we're talking about, this is where I argue it's all a wash. Most of those decisions can be made in situ based on what seems right to your experiential reason. That you don't have to be a genius to make the right calls in these situations.
No, you just have to have a strong enough moral character to make the right calls.
In which case, what you really need to do is just be practicing the faith for the most part. And all of our attempts to educate ourselves are secondary, if not tertiary.
I think we can do both, but yeah, I think about like the civil rights example. That kind of springs to mind. I mean, people in that, I was just thinking about the fact that this is like No King's Day, and I'm sure there's like a huge crowd of people in Kansas City and other cities that are protesting. And I considered, I was like, well, is something I should do. And one of my criteria is when these people stop dressing up like Handmaid's Tale folks and get serious, then maybe I'll go, So, and they're still doing that. Like they're literally organizing by blocks around themes that I consider to be sort of party themes. So it's kind of weird. But anyway, but, like the civil rights protests were real, right? And these people were like willing to risk their lives because it was that crucial to them.
And I would only grant that they were semi-real. I mean, I'll grant what you're saying, but what did they want? They wanted their bourgeois civil rights.
Yeah, but that was very important to them at the time to like take them to the next level where they could maybe want more. I think within the civil rights vision, there was a vision of wanting more, right?
But satanic question, or did they integrate into the system that's rotten to the core, and now they all have a stake in the Leviathan?
Well, both, right? Because of course, in hindsight, that move wasn't great, but I'll tell you what, it was way greater than what they had before, Spencer. Like put yourself back in their shoes and ask yourself, you wouldn't rather be like a bourgeois, subject of the United States with legal equality. I think I know what the answer will be. So I think we need to like,
compared to what? A slave? In the modern sense?
Or yeah, like, basically a poor laboring Black person in Alabama pre-1960s was basically just, a slave. And a lot of white people were a little bit better off than that, but not by much. But then the Black people had to endure all that racial prejudice and exclusion and constant terrorism from roving gangs of people that wanted to kill them just for the fun of it. So I think that, I fully understand why they would want to have what white people had at that point. And that was a major achievement. Now, I'm not saying we should have stopped or that they should have stopped, and I don't think they did necessarily stop, but I don't want to downplay that. It's an example of people able to accomplish something quite real for themselves.
Right. And
because they were willing to
finish what you're saying.
Because they were willing to risk their lives. Whereas, what we're not at that point, I guess was the point I'm making, not even close, right? So the seriousness with which they approach their mission is very exemplary. That's all I'm saying.
Sure. But again, that has more to do with like their basic moral and spiritual comportment than it does necessarily their intellectual education.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Intellectual education. But yes, I don't want to downplay it, but I also don't want to overplay it, because too hastily people want to make the idea that look what happened for African Americans in the 60s, and then say somehow or other reorganizing global capital to combat climate change will take the same methods.
No, and those issues are so much bigger that you couldn't tackle them in the same way, and probably they're not tackleable at all.
But I promise you, in these artistic, what the Alpha Bunga Bunga people call the mango the mango circles, the media, the academics, the NGOs. This is a story that gets pumped out. This is the left-wing equivalent of shithead Christian nationalism.
I know.
Let us read the abolitionists, let us read the civil rights people and Gandhi, and you will see how we can change late capitalism as it corrects post-neo.
What I'm trying to say is that they are not willing to do anything like what those folks did. They want to write articles. They want to have ideas. I've reviewed plenty of these woo-woo books, right, about how we're going to change the world, written by academics who should know better, right? So I'm fully aware of that dimension of things. But the distinction is they're just not even in the same business. So they may make that comparison to themselves, but I think they're wrong, is what I'm saying. Like, they're not anywhere near at the level of seriousness of the civil rights folks.
They want to what?
Yeah, at the most, yeah.
Right, and here's where, to me, this whole discussion is kind of annoying. To me, it's a matter of intellectual hygiene, about thinking about Christian nationalism and thinking about the left-wing mangoes is kind of like dwelling on multiplication or something. It is a kind of adolescent intellectual paradigm, not befitting the dignity of smart adults.
Seems like I should be saying that. No, I mean, we do have to, I will insist, that you do have to pay attention to what's going on, and not to get into these like not to get into this level of like my entire life revolves around what happens in national politics. But again, I mean, nothing can happen if people don't know what's going on. So, I mean, I just can't come up with a good excuse for that.
And that is not my position. My position is all of this stuff is hierarchically mediated. And so paying attention is not me as an individual figuring it out. It's me as an individual doing the best job I can so that can sort of eucharistically ripple out and hopefully positively impact the hierarchy, because we are inescapably hierarchical. And so whenever whatever change happens, it will come to us mediated by the hierarchies we're still embedded in. And so I don't have to figure it out. I just have to figure out my sphere as best I can. And yes, to some extent, I'm not making an argument. I think I'm perceived to make an argument about never watch the news, or, I mean, obviously I read a lot of books.
Mm-hmm.
Part of my beef with the news is it's low quality information.
It definitely is. Yeah.
Whereas,
I mean, you can get higher quality information, though. You don't have to get low quality information.
Yeah. Well, but I think there's just an inherent limitation. I think it is superior to wait for the news to build up for 4 years and be put in a book than for you to piece together the news over the course of 5 years. Is part of my position.
If you have to choose.
Right. Anyway, point being, there was a time early on in this latest administration where I think you were especially mad at me for not being interested in the news, and you made the argument that well, what happens if there is some sort of uprising or some sort of radical thing happening? And my argument was, well, I'm not going to have to be sitting around for the news. If this social ferment is happening, I will know. If the news is, I am to a greater or lesser extent getting out in society. If the news is big enough, I will hear it through other people. And I realize on one hand, you could say I'm outsourcing my responsibility to other people, to which I say, yeah, because I live in a society, however debased it has become.
I think what annoys me is that you turn your position into some sort of, it seems like you want to say that you know better than most people, or that you're more mature than most people, or whatever it is, because you don't pay as much attention to this, which makes other people, such as myself, somehow look stupid for paying attention. And that's, I mean, I'm not going to agree. So there's no way I can agree, right, to that position. I think there's a way that, and I'm not saying that this is actually, I don't know what your intent is, but that's the way it comes across, or kind of the implication of it is that if you don't take this stance, that you're somehow like intellectually and emotionally immature. I think you pretty much just said that. So, of course, I'm not going to agree with that. And I suspect I can do all of those things, right? I can pay attention to basically what's going on in the world. I can also read books, and I can also like think beyond those things while strategizing for both my own safety, my future, and a whole bunch of other things at the same time.
Mhm.
So I don't really have to choose. And I think that there still is this responsibility, that I have as a member of this society to make these intermediate judgments about what I will and won't do, and what I, will and won't say, and what I will and will not vote for. Even those are very small, but I can do those things without like sacrificing a whole lot of other things, because I'm able to juggle all of those things. And
Right.
that's,
And
so.
and I think the more I've thought about it, I think what you and I are disagreeing on is more at an emotional level than it is an intellectual level. Because
Mhm.
my contention is, let's say a voice rains down from heaven and we find out we have 10 minutes to live. So our life is over. We're on our
Yeah.
death. I am afraid when I face that I will see in retrospect that I frittered away maximizing my responsibility as an individual by trying to sort of intellectually range around to things that were like more or less irrelevant or tertiary or quadrutiary or something to my life. And so I'm partly impelled by this drive, especially, I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago, but especially now, to like get my house in order and not worry about the neighborhood across the street, figuratively.
Mhm.
And at an intellectual level, I tell myself that very thing. Maybe I can do all of it. I can listen to podcasts about geopolitics while I do this other stuff. But I'm always whispered in the other ear that perhaps I'm not giving my all that I actually am meant to give to the other fork in the road.
Mhm.
And that's part of what impels me to be like, I would like to think I can do it all. And yet every day it's reinforced that I can actually do very little.
Right. Well, I mean, doing it all is not something that I do either, because nobody can do that, right?
What told you
If
so?
I had, for what it's worth, if I had 10 minutes left, I wouldn't even be thinking about what I had or had not accomplished. I'd be thinking about calling my son. So, I mean, I think we all have to think about what's most important to us. Also, you probably ought to be thinking about, have I lived, right? And I would say you have. I'd say I have too. But like, have I lived is a different question from what have I thought about or what have I accomplished, even, right? Right. It's, have I lived my life, right? Which is kind of hard to define, but when you haven't. You sure do.
And part of living means a fair amount of accomplishing things, I
I
would argue.
guess. Yeah. I mean, most of our accomplishments nobody's gonna know about them even like after we die, like almost immediately.
Sure.
Um, so yes, it's important, but it's not probably paramount compared to, our relationships with God and with the people around us. That's probably more important. And doing right by them,
Right.
is.
All of which takes, this is what I meant by accomplishments, the intellectual and mental and manual work. Where you are. I'm calling that accomplishments. And
Okay. Yeah. Well, then we're probably somewhat in agreement there, right? If you think, though, that, I mean, I've published 8 books and I've got like a resume that's 16 pages long, right? And I know that even when I retire within 10 years, even my own colleagues will barely remember me, right? Like, let alone that somebody's going to remember me because of my books.
I'm afraid half of my coworkers don't remember me now.
Some of my coworkers might not be sure I work for the same department. I'm not sure. I had that problem with one of the guys that worked for my department for the first 10 years. I'm like, I'm not sure if he works with us or with some other department.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think we all have to keep that in mind. You don't have delusions of grandeur about like what you're going to be able to accomplish. What you do is contribute to a collective effort, hopefully, right? Of that generally tends in one direction or another. So what you do is still important. It's just not important in the sense that the American dream is you're gonna, like you're gonna like create a monument to yourself. That's another thing that the American government owes you is the ability to create a monument to yourself. And they just don't, that just hardly ever happens.
But I guess to take a half step back, just to make it clear, what I was saying about, to me, Christian nationalism, such as it is, and its left-wing mirror image, is such a sort of contorted and also understandable way of viewing the world that it is a matter of intellectual hygiene to not dwell on this so much, because it is like the intellectual equivalent of processed food, and you should not consume it very much, and you should not want to fight it too much, because part of it comes out, I think I've thought a lot about this, and I just intuitively, it feels very true that you will tend to become who you think your enemy is, your prime enemy. There's the Nietzsche quote about, if you gaze into the abyss gazes into you. I've gazed into the abyss of these things, and I've gazed into it enough to be like, oh shit, I should not live in that world, and I don't want to, and I don't have to. And
right, you don't have to.
That there aren't people around, and then they aren't having effects in the world, and that most of their victories are these kind of Pyrrhic victories where actually, you're helping like Iran get bombed or whatever. But nevertheless, you just should not gaze into that abyss so long. Otherwise, it's not good. It's not good for anyone.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah. And I know that, like, I know a lot of people do it one way or the other, where all they see is that, right? And then every discussion is that.
Correct. And they are the opposite.
Right. And then that makes you feel.
Tell you who you are.
Right.
And
so obviously that's treading water. That's not really going anywhere.
Clearly, it's going with the flow. Right. And to me, it comes down to, as Christians, we are supposed to, our enemies are evil, sin, death, the devil. And I would add the Marxian addendum that it's the abstract domination of capital and encircling the globe, which appears to people like power in the Foucaultian sense or something like that. And that is like, if there's anything worth having an enemy, it is that, and not a sort of political sect that's just another like repeated pattern that liberalism constantly throws up of people trying to salvage some vestige of pre-modern religious and divine and natural laws and meld them to nationalism or internationalism, or realistically both.
Yeah, I can agree to all of that. Would you agree that in that broader sense, whether it's Christian nationalism or internationalism, in which people look at this big provider or like, and not God, that is some sort of theological error, because it's state worship or system worship, and that has become confounded with God Almighty himself. Is that a sin?
And I would say there's a baptized version of it that is not inherently sinful, and then there is the pagan and modern version of it that is inherently sinful. That, like, the Orthodox and the Catholic position is that there are Christian emperors and kings, and it is kind of our Christian duty to give them our assent. And that assent is not what you have to give sort of absolute rulers, but nevertheless, there is a kind of sanctified, sacramental rulership that is ordained by God. I think it follows. If you believe in the social kingship of Christ, until we're in heaven, what that means is that's mediated to us by the clergy and secondarily by temporal authorities.
Regardless of whether they're genuine or not? So, like, how are you going to be able to tell, in other words, a Christian leader from one that isn't?
Sure is tough, ain't it? Well, actually, it's not so tough now, because we've given up on these concepts of sacramental leadership.
Right. So, but in the world as we are in now, can you name a single like leader that you would consider a Christian leader that should be sort of taken seriously like that? Or a country?
I think there still are, to some extent, like confessional states. I think for the most part, it goes back to that interview I did for the first Midnight Lands episode. I think to the extent that theocracy and monarchy continues to exist, it exists in these kind of attenuated postmodern forms. It exists sort of in like the peripheries and the rubble of nation states abstractly dominated by capital. And it exists dispersed to a greater or lesser extent in the hierarchies we're still in.
Not sure that helps me too much, but like,
because if it didn't exist at all, it would all just be like outright evil. I guess to me, it comes down to, a while ago, we were reading St. Maximus the Confessor, and the Communio, the way the Communio theologians reiterate his point that there is no such thing as pure nature. And so if there's no such thing as pure nature, then a lot of what we take to be natural is actually already infused with grace. And so my contention is, however bad things have gotten, there's still all sorts of ways in which God is subsidizing us through grace. And if he weren't, the situation would be even worse. I think there's a St. Paul line somewhere about where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And then he adds, never sin.
St. Paul is another matter, right? Like, but we'd have to do like a whole podcast on that. But it does seem like St. Paul did do a lot more like thinking through what Christians should think of government and what the relationship should be, and probably could be like brought to bear to endorse, that point of view. I don't know if, you could make an argument. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad argument, but anyway.
Right. And just to be clear, like, what I'm representing is what I take to be the kind of mainstream, again, Orthodox Catholic position post the Constantinian turn, which obviously in various ways is problematic, but nevertheless, the main point is like, should rulers be officially and practically, should they be formally and materially Christian? And the answer is ideally yes.
Sure.
And obviously, we're in a situation where that is all very murky, and it makes our duty for obedience even more murky. Although I insist, in effect, as long as we want our money to keep coming in, we are more or less obeying our rulers, whether it's our boss at work, all the way on up through society.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, our tradition is the origin of natural law. And so I think, one of the things to kind of just add is that, the way a Catholic, I think, would discern whether government is actually reflecting the purposes of God would be to just match up natural law with what it does, right? So you see sort of the fruitfulness of government based upon those principles. Is it preserving life? Is it properly defending people? Does everybody have at least the necessities of life? Basic things like that. I think, we're given these tools to be able to judge whether or not our government is actually reflecting these Christian principles or not. And I think we're supposed to, that's part of what it's the purpose of natural law teaching is to give us those tools to be able to say this isn't unjust. And you look back through, medieval history as this develops, and you see like people within the church making these judgments about government, saying that it's either this person is a Christian leader or not. Sometimes saying that the leader is the spawn of Satan, basically.
Partly this was the sake of getting excommunicated, is part of what it meant is your people or your guards are released from a duty of obedience and then therefore might want to kill you.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess, I think if we just add that we are given like tools to use, right, that we're supposed to use to discern whether, our leaders and our government is generally, and it's a pretty low bar, right? Like, but still, I don't think a lot of modern governments meet it very well, right? They're not preserving resources.
It depends who you ask. If you bracket out everything you know from media and you just looked around Manhattan.
Don't ask me that question, okay? I'm looking around Manhattan and I see money being wasted left and right and people not being taken care of. Gross level corruption. So that's what I see, among other things. Yeah, sure, we're still alive, but like we have a ton of homeless people and it's pretty bleak here, actually, when you really open your eyes and look at it. So I know we talked about this last time, but I'm still not man happy. Sorry. It's a good thing this is well into the podcast and the Manhattanites won't be listening to it, but yeah.
Our 1.5 viewer has made it.
Sorry, I'm sure that's not where you wanted me to go with that, right? Like,
yeah. I'm just saying. I'm saying for a critical mass of the population, America is doing day to day, they're surviving. And I guess it's a question of what is the bar? And the brunt of Orthodox Catholic tradition is for survival. It's actually pretty low. As for how things should be, the bar is pretty high. But that's the difference between the hypothesis and the thesis.
Yeah, survival and enough survival for spiritual growth, because there's those 3 dimensions, the vegetative, the animal, and the reason spirit dimension. And if your society is surviving, but it's at the level where it can't really fully appreciate and worship and understand, try to understand God, then it's not good enough yet, right? And I guess as much as we have these various dimensions where some people are homeless and other people are really rich and a lot of people are in between. And you could make the argument, and I would agree, that like a country like this is better off, even now, like most people are way financially better off than they would be in a lot of other societies or at different times. But it is blocking like the human dimension, right? Excessively. Like there's an inverse relationship between the mere survival and kind of like income for a lot of people and their actual spiritual development. I mean, at a human level, not just in religion, but just in like, I don't even know how to describe it, but living their life as human beings rather than as consumers and workers and social media
And this
personalities.
is part of that we are more barbaric than primitive religious peoples, because at least they had the good sense to have natural law and a natural religion.
Right. Yeah. Like they live their lives in relation to each other, and they had many of them anyway, would have had their minds set on something higher than themselves, both their tribe or whatever, their people, as well as their religion, and spent a lot of more of their time dwelling in those spaces than just especially getting things, right? Like getting things was to live rather than living to get things. And so, yeah, like that's a dimension that's not filled. And I think we ought to, well, we do a lot of criticizing of our society for that. And I think rightly so. And that, I mean, that definitely is supported by natural law thinking. And it's a problem regardless of who's in charge. But we're very poor in that sense. And part of what I see when I look around is that. I mean, yeah, I've got a fence and I've got a house and I could be worse off, definitely could be way worse off financially, but I'm living in a human level wasteland. And it's not just Manhattan. It's everywhere.
I can imagine I'm always like, do not think Kansas City is that much better.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is either. It's definitely bigger, so it's got more types of people in it and more options for what to do and who to be with. But it's actually very similar otherwise. You know, it's just bigger.
50 Shades of American.
Right, right. Well, before we sign off, do you have any other parting words? Because we probably should pretty soon. It's been about what? Well, yeah, it's been about an hour and a half, I guess.
Yeah. Emily just texted and said she's running really late because the No Kings protest has really slowed down traffic downtown.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, it's probably really big. I think this is probably going to be the biggest one yet. But like I said, there's too many people wearing costumes there still. It's just really,
and you know what?
I find that super off-putting.
And you know what? They can not watch the news between now and the elections, and they know who they're going to vote for.
They're definitely know who they're going to vote for.
And
right.
Probably the election after that, and probably the election after that. And
I'm
if
sure you're right.
Major happens that we enter into a new party system or whatever, they'll find out about it without having to watch the news.
They will. Well, for what it's worth, I don't watch cable news. I don't even have cable. I wanted to show you like what my cat did. Okay, now these are old. My parents used to have these. These are walkie-talkies. I think personal radios. Okay, and so if you can see, the tips of the antennas have been eaten away. Yep. And there's a little coil in there that is now exposed. Mm-hmm. So somewhere in Cardi's stomach is about a ½ inch of rigid black plastic. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping she'll be okay. I can't imagine why a cat would do this.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what I think about when I'm trying to fall asleep and I'm trying to not think about Christian nationalism or...
I don't think you try that hard, but okay. What?
Or globalist, crypto nationalism. They think about all the plastic insulation
Mm,
everywhere that's being gnawed on simultaneously by mice and how they're going to
mm.
run around and poop all of that out.
Ugh.
And we're living, we create these unnatural or subnatural materials, and then just mice and cockroaches and yeah, cats, dogs. They're still, man, 2026, they're manufacturing plastic dog chew toys. And
Isn't that awful?
the dogs are just chewing them up and pooping
And
them
they're
out.
getting plastic in their bodies and then they're shooting it, pooping it out on the ground. So it's getting into everything else. It is just the dumbest use of plastic, stuff like that.
Yep. I mean, to me, it's like if you really contemplate it enough, you're like, this is proof that hell exists. This is proof that ontological evil exists, or doesn't
For
exist.
sure.
I believe in privation theory of non-being or whatever. But the existence of the non-existent, how is it possible? They're probably, I haven't looked, but I bet if you go to Walmart, they're selling like plastic chew toys like for kids.
You know, they probably are rattles and things that they can put in their mouths, little teething rings made out of plastic with water inside and stuff. Yes. Yes. And I think until very recently, when they discovered silicon was a selling factor, almost all kids' baby chew things were made out of some kind of plastic.
Mhm.
Isn't that just ridiculous? I mean, it's just, and I think it was and is so taken for granted. People don't even really see it. They don't see, they couldn't possibly see what's right in front of their eyes. It's, like literally monstrous, right? Um, yeah, I don't
Or
know.
you,
If people don't know what we're talking about, probably.
I don't know. I mean, if they don't, it's because they haven't really thought about it because it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous.
Right. I would just tell people, if you're still listening, one and a half persons, to just walk into a grocery store with your mind focused just on plastic and go up and down the aisles and realize that all that plastic is petroleum, and realize that the plastic packaging on all of your food is also seeping into your food and into you. I mean, just even getting rid of the health concerns though, and just thinking about the fact that the entire grocery store, probably if you weighed the grocery store and you'd have to take away the walls and stuff, but just like the contents of it, I would say what, maybe like 30% of the weight would be just nothing but plastic. Maybe I'm underestimating.
Yeah.
And then just think about the fact that that's petroleum. So we know that's a limited resource. And everything that we do now is run on petroleum, including agriculture, from fertilizers and pesticides. They're all petroleum. And
Right.
so
And
we're
it's
a
like
country so dumb.
most of the
Huh?
clothes, most of the clothes.
Clothes. Exactly. You can hardly get clothes without it. You have to try really hard.
And then imagine you're mowing lawns in the inner city and you're coming across where homeless people have gotten polyester clothing and then they've started trash fires with the clothes or, with the plastic containers they've gotten from food pantries.
Hmm.
And then it's
And it's
all,
this melted, yeah,
yeah, or it's either,
molten.
yeah, it's gone in the air or it's melted into the ground. And then again, it's going in the ground. It's getting chewed up by roly-polies and worms.
Hmm. We've created a disaster that we don't even know, the full, we can't comprehend the full extent. Imagine people 100 years from now or aliens that come and look at like the aftermath of our civilization, and probably the number one artifact is going to be all this plastic. It's just,
Yep. Right. And
yeah.
one thing, if we're not, again, in a responsible, neo-Christendom or a communist utopia, we probably have plastic used for medical, needles.
Mhm.
There's a place for plastics. But
Yes.
instead, we try to find literally every place for plastics. And this will coexist. What were the Americans fighting about in 2026? And is every immigrant a beautiful person, and borders are social constructs?
Hmm. And
Or,
not get rid of plastic.
yeah, America is for the wasps.
Right.
And then we're back. We're
Yeah.
back at the foundation. This goes back to the beginning of the podcast. Nick talking about fighting fracking. The fracking company was sucking it out while the conversation was happening.
Hmm. And what was happening to it? A lot of it was going to stuff that's going to be thrown in the trash.
Mm-hmm.
We are the most wasteful. And one way to look at this, folks, if you're still listening, is I think that only an invalid grandma who can't lift her head needs to use a straw. And the rest of us just need to suck it up, some other way.
How long ago was it, the video with the turtle and pulling the straw out? You know what I'm talking
God. Yeah.
about?
What was
Probably
that,
a
15,
decade
20
ago.
years ago? A long time ago.
I bet it was a decade ago. But to me, that was a case in point of a certain type of person was
Yeah.
sentimentally upset. And then after 6 months, 12 months, well, we got to have straws.
You forget about it. Yeah. Right. And
And
honestly, I don't know how many times you've gone and you've gotten food, which is why people need to I go through phases where I'm like, I just am too busy to cook. And then I go and I get something at a restaurant and I say, I don't need straws. I don't need like plastic utensils. And guess what? 9 times out of 10, there they are, right? Like they give them to you anyway. So now you've got to tote them home. What are you going to do with those? Right. And if here in this town, if you say you don't want them, you're likely to get lip about how you're fancy or about how there's something wrong with you. That's how wonderful this place is. Like you're going to get a lecture about how you're practically not an American because you don't want a straw. Like I used to have a friend who literally created political statements around her use of straws, which I believe is infantile,
Mhm.
because it is. So like, it's so fun.
And adulting means, and I think this is the general counsel of the saints, is you have to block all of this insanity out and try and be a virtuous person.
Yeah, I hear
Yeah.
what you're saying. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's right. Like even for me, I'm not going to be able to block that out as much as you. It's partly because it is my job. Also, I'm just inherently a political mind. I mean, that's why I have that job. But um, but I've adopted some habits um, for the sake of sanity that I sometimes let go of, and then I have to get back. Right. Um, Definitely during Lent, I've been really good about not focusing on news in the morning and not focusing on I've been trying to focus on God in the morning. So, like, that definitely helps the rest of your day, right? It is very important to think about what are your priorities as far as how you order your day. That's for sure.
Right.
So,
The order of operations. If you have to climb into a spiritual sewer, it's fine, I guess, but try and shower afterwards.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose the same thing goes with plastic because if you were to focus on that continually, you'd probably just like get so depressed. I am literally sitting at a table right now that I got, I don't know, 15 years ago now, whose
Mhm.
top is it's like a plastic granite replica.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's not real. It's plastic.
Mhm.
I mean, if I threw this out, if I was going to get another table, well, I'd probably try to find somebody else to take it. But you know what happens to a lot of this stuff, right? So this 4x4 piece of thick plastic would be there forever in some landfill. It's never going to go away.
Right. Which I guess, the landfills are basically municipal litter boxes. And I guess it's better that it all gets congregated and hopefully sealed in with the liner or whatever they line it with than disperse.
I don't think they line it. They don't line it.
No, aren't they?
I don't think so. No, I have no idea, but I've never heard of that. So I guess you have. So maybe that's a thing. But you hear about like stuff leaching into rivers and streams all the time from landfills.
Well,
yeah, look it up and see. We don't have one here. We have a transfer station, so I've never actually seen one since I've been an adult who pays attention.
Supposedly, modern landfills are required to have complex liner systems to prevent hazardous liquid from contaminating groundwater. These typically use a composite design, a thick layer of compacted clay combined with a plastic membrane. 60 mil plastic liner.
Oh, what is that? Probably an inch thick or more. It's probably 2 or 3 inches thick. So plastic is the lining. Okay.
And then at least 2 feet of compacted clay is used, often below the plastic layer for an extra barrier. And above the liner, a network of pipes and gravel exists to collect liquid and pump it out for treatment.
Ew.
And felt-like fabric is used to protect the liners from clogging or damage. So,
how can we
that's
even
why,
do this?
In general, I deal with a lot of trash with my job. And it's like, I hope the hierarchs at the landfill can do a better job than I can.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot you can do. I mean, that's why, the emphasis on composting and recycling in the natural sense, not with plastic, but yeah.
I was recently looking at in Cairo, there's a group, they're called the Zabaleen, but they're just means, I think that's Arabic for like trash people, but they're like 90% Coptic Christians. And they kind of live on the outskirts of the city, and they like by hand sort all of the trash, and most of it goes to their pigs. And then they have all of these cottage industries where they process all the recycled stuff and send it off.
No way.
Made like documentaries about, on the one hand, how effective they are, and then it seems to me the deflating thing is it's just a story of like poor people laboring, like people want.
So they're
high tech fix. It's just
are they kind of like? Sorry, is it kind of like they're the untouchables?
Kind of, especially if you go to, they keep the pigs, which Muslims aren't allowed to keep, and so they're dirty on multiple levels from
Gotcha.
Judeo-Muslimic perspective.
That's horrendous. Wow.
Yeah, but they've made documentaries about them, and like there's like UN accolades they've received for doing a good job, because basically they're working for low wages and doing a good job with their manual labor.
Sure.
And then of course the government tried to modernize and bring in like Spanish and Italian trash processing companies that do a worse job and cost more money.
It sounds like an abusive system. On the other hand, I'm sure the world would be worse off if they didn't do that work. But wow, there are people in other countries that do similar type of work for us, that sorting all of our trash and but We seriously
A
need to
lot of
make
these places, they usually have a plastic sommelier whose job it is when it's unclear what a plastic is, that they burn it. And by the whiff of it, they can tell if it's a 2 or a 6 or an 8 or whatever.
guess who's going to get cancer, right? Wow. Mm. Well, this is a whole nother topic. We could probably, you know, we should do a Grange just on like dealing with plastic. I think this is something both of us really, it's such a huge problem. There is no easy solution to this. So it's worth discussing in its own right, right? Like here again, like what does a responsible person do? That's the same sort of question I ask myself, like as a responsible person, what do I do? Right. And I've changed over time, but still I look around my house and it's like, you know what? It's almost impossible. It is impossible to live unless you want to spend most of your life figuring out how to avoid plastic. Right. In which case you can't have a job and you can't do anything else with your life. There's so much that can't be done or had without plastic. It would be it's practically impossible. It's practically impossible. And yet we know it's affecting fertility rates hugely.
Right. And even if you as an individual somehow did, it's still leaking in from your surrounding environment.
Right. Yeah, I don't even know how you could do it, but you could reduce it. And I watched a documentary on Netflix. I forget what the name of it is, but it just came out recently. And it's about a doctor who did a small scale experiment. She's done a lot of like bigger research projects on this, but she did a small scale experiment with something like 5 couples who are infertile due to I think in all cases it was like low sperm count. And so she put them through this really kind of radical, like, not gonna have, no plastic, get rid of as much plastic as possible, including all the cosmetic products and clothing. All their clothing had to be natural fibers. They had to get rid of furniture that had plastic in the fibers and so on. And they really did. She tested their blood every week to show how much chemical difference there was over time through less exposure to plastics. So she could determine how successful they were at reducing their levels of exposure. And then she tracked the sperm motility, quantity and motility. And, you could see like a pretty strong correlation, albeit a small number of people. I think 3 of the couples got pregnant after, like years of trying for some of them. Like some of them been trying 10 years. And within like a half a year of doing this, 3 of these couples got pregnant, if I'm recalling right. It was either 2 or 3. And, I think we need to pay serious attention to that. It's the reason why I think so many people have fertility problems now, right? It's a big reason.
Yeah.
Men, I should say men, because it didn't really focus on women, but how could it not affect women as well?
Could it not? Yeah.
One thing it said was it's bringing about like premature puberty in women. So they're having like their periods as early as 10 years old now.
Sure. And then you have to wonder how much, if it's doing that, if it's affecting sort of pre-pubescent women, it's not like whatever the plastic is doing is stopping at puberty. Like,
no. And they have correlated the earliness with which you get your period to the development of various reproductive cancers later on, because the longer that you're fertile, the more likely it is that you'll develop cancer. So like the normal fertility, the normal point where a female is supposed to sort of become like fertile is more like 14. So if you're starting 4 years early, that gives you that much longer of this hyper hormonal state that tends to be a correlating factor with reproductive cancer. Anyway, like I'm sounding like a doctor now, but like this stuff has convinced me that that is a serious reason why our overall population growth is declining, which maybe is good for the planet, but like it's for the wrong reasons though. It's very alarming, to think that people someday might not be able to reproduce themselves.
Sure. Right. And I don't, for whatever it's worth, I wouldn't even concede it's good for the planet. It's like, it's good for the planet if we take as normal a late capitalist American subject.
Right.
It's bad for the planet in a world of like a neo-Christendom or a communist international where actually more people means more labor really gets done and more
Yes.
worthwhile.
Right. Then
Actually,
that same number of people could.
We need that labor to help recover from this dark age.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
Good point.
This is the point where, again, if you are in these more adolescent, sophomoric intellectual spaces, you can never realize that, like, this is where our industry and ecology meets up with everybody's concerns about reproducing the species.
Mm-hmm. And, consequently, people's fears about immigrants who tend to be more fertile because they come from places where there's less consumer capitalism, right? And so there's this dimension of our existing, what we're all arguing about right now that has a lot to do with our ways of life right now. That's probably a real factor there because, the more that you live this way, the fatter people get and the less fertile people get. And typical to form, you start like blaming the invader, right, for your problems rather than looking at, your own priorities. But yeah.
Or your own backwards society.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess a final thought. This is at my best what I'm shooting for when you think I'm being like churlish or a punk or whatever. I think what I've come around to, and I've been chewing on doing like a Midnight Lands episode about this, but it's been generally seen like within religious traditions in general, and even within Catholicism, that apathy, properly understood, is a virtue. Like apatheia, and where it's good to be apathetic is it's not allowing a kind of spiritualized apathy. Isn't just depression or despondency. It's a capacity to be so focused on like God and your neighbor and your family and what is true and good and beautiful that your equilibrium is not disturbed by all of the evil and the non-being that besets us to a greater or lesser extent on all sides.
Okay.
So I think part of what I've been shooting at for a while, especially emotionally, it comes off as intellectual like indifference or like hubris, but it's trying to get to a kind of like spiritualized interior life where these things aren't like treated. It's not like I'm denying that they exist, but it's like giving them too much credence is I guess like a fault in the spiritual life, is what I've been sort of intuitively trying to get at for a few years, and I've only now just like recognized that that was kind of what I think I was trying to aim at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that makes more sense, I would just say, just based on my own personal experience, that it is possible that, or to put it another way, it's probably a superhuman feat to truly be apathetic, and that sometimes some of that can just be like gut muscling our way through a situation by ignoring it. And to the extent that we do that, we put off the day of reckoning when we have to emotionally deal with what's happening. So I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, but I am saying in my own experience that is a thing, right? So that I think sometimes, and I know I've made this mistake of being like overly strong, as in nothing bothers me, right? Only to find out that basically I was just putting that off until like, I couldn't anymore. So I think there's this middle ground where if you take the proper stance towards these things, which is kind of a mourning and like, what am I like realistically responsible for? That is not an emotionally bad way of handling the situation, right? Everybody's different too, but for me, I think I've kind of come to the conclusion that those two things are going to be a part of my life now, which is, I'm going to continue to think about what my personal responsibility is. And I think you do too. And then B, like, what attitude am I going to cop towards these things that are happening in the world? And I come back around to mourning. I don't think I'm in a fighting mood, but I do think it's appropriate to be like, if this stuff doesn't upset you part of the time, you probably haven't fully like fathomed it, or like at emotional level. Like at an intellectual level, maybe you have, and again, I'm using you kind of generically, right? But emotionally, maybe not. And in order to like
emotionally upset, but they're not really intellectually thinking it through.
Right. There's those two extremes.
They get dressed up like a Handmaid's Tale as a sort of parody satirization of the administration. It's not to do the intellectual work to really think about, like, even forget about critiquing your own position. Do you really think that's their position? You think these guys just want to like lock women up? I'm sure a few of them do.
Yeah, a few of them do, but
sure.
In their head, in their fantasy life, but their women would just basically kill them if they tried to do that. So I can give it a shot.
There's a certain amount of sociopaths in every like group and category and whatever, and like their existence doesn't like disprove the ideology or the political party that they're party to.
Right.